Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar and thanks for coming. We'll be starting in a couple of minutes, but just while we give people a chance to join, we're going to be playing a video, a campaign video from the Building Access project. So we'll be playing that for 2 minutes and then getting started. So hello everyone, thanks for being here. My name's Freya Higgins. I'm currently leading the Building Access project for People with Disability Australia, which is a project that aims to make domestic and family violence services more inclusive. And we have a wonderful network of domestic and family violence services who provide recommendations on what they would like more information about. And this webinar will be recorded and put up on our website. Before I go any further, I'll just also let you know I'm vision impaired, but I'll do my best to describe myself. I have dark blonde hair, I'm wearing charcoal glasses, I am wearing a striped black and white top, and in my background, I have a cat scratching post, I have a Chinese artwork, and I have a couple of pictures from my nieces. I would also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we're all working and living on. I work and live on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend my respect to any First Nations people here today or watching this in the future, and also acknowledge that it always has been and always will be Aboriginal land. I think it's really important that we talk about the NDIS in the context of the domestic and family violence sector. We know that services who support women who experience abuse will be coming into contact with and supporting disabled women, and that often intimate partners and carers and service providers might be perpetrators, but might also be providing essential care to women. And it's often very difficult to access and then navigate the NDIS. And I know that it's a very new space for the domestic and family violence sector as well. But, you know, when we hear of women who need to escape abusive situations and rebuild their lives, services, and in some cases, the NDIS is going to be a really important part of that process. So I'm really excited and grateful to have Frances here to speak to us and teach us a bit about advocacy and the NDIS. Frances is our Senior Research and Policy Officer here at People with Disability Australia. She has worked in the community and disability sector for 18 years, and she is a social scientist and a graduate social worker. She's also doing her PhD at the moment in community research, policy translation, and the implementation of the CRPD in Australia. Frances lives and works digitally in the Pine Rivers region north of Brisbane with her family and 2 rescue dogs. So without taking any more time, because I know that we have a lot to get through, I'll hand it over to you, Frances. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Freya. Yes, I'm not an avatar, so I myself am not digital, though I am coming to you from via digital means. I'd just like to recognise that I live and work on Cubby Cubby country, which is here in southeast Queensland. So I'll give you a description. So I am a woman with blondish, shortish hair. I'm wearing dark framed glasses. I also have a headset on with a microphone. I'm wearing a green top and I have a necklace on with some grey wood on it. I don't know if you can see that. In my background, I have a piano with a clock on it and some items. And to one side, I have my printer. This is my home office, so there are home items in it. And I also apologise if you hear any background noise. As Freya mentioned, I do have 2 dogs, and the neighbours have dogs, and they bark randomly. I also have my partner here who is working at the same time. So if you hear a male voice in the background, that's him working. So I apologise for that. Okay. Any questions? No? Okay. All right, let's start. I've created a very compact presentation around the NDIS and advocacy because we only have 1 hour. It is a relatively complex process once you get into it. But I am aware that a lot of women who access the NDIS may or may not experience some form of family and domestic violence. Chances are there's an intersection there. However, only 38% of disabled women in Australia actually access the NDIS. And it's worth noting that the NDIS does not have a gender equity strategy. So it hasn't created a strategy to address the differences between men accessing the NDIS and women accessing the NDIS. I'll note that the NDIS has a COLD strategy and it has an LGBTI strategy, but it doesn't have a women's or gender equity strategy. Okay, so disability rights are civil rights. There's no doubt about that. If people were with us last week, we covered the CRPD and that covers our civil and political rights as disabled people. And you may also remember that the NDIS is one of Australia's commitments to implementing the CRPD. Only one. It's not a panacea, and it's not the only one. It's actually one part of a greater strategy. But very often, the NDIS is pitched as the strategy for all disabled people. It's not true, because at the moment, the strategy is only designed to cover 10% of disabled people in Australia. So at the moment, it's designed for 500,000 people. And there are 4.5 million disabled people in Australia. And it only covers supports and services. So it's quite narrow. Okay, let's pop on to the next slide. Fantastic. So what is the NDIS? The NDIS is the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Now, oftentimes people hear the word insurance and think of it like your car insurance or a version of health insurance. No, this particular model of insurance is a social safety net. It's like Medicare. And what people don't realise is that Medicare is actually a form of insurance. But for so long, we have only understood insurance in the framework of private sector and for-profit. This is insurance for the social good, different concept. Interestingly, the NDIS as a concept in Australia came from people with disability. It was one of the suggestions, and I don't know if you all remember back in 2008, I think it was, when Kevin Rudd was still Prime Minister and he had his 2020 vision. And lots of people from all over Australia went to Parliament House to talk about all the things we want to achieve by 2020. This was one of the ideas. The original concept was put together by disabled people who said, this is what we want. So when we talk about the NDIS is our scheme, we really do mean that. It is our scheme. It was our idea and we made it happen. Why did we want it to happen? Well, prior to the NDIS, we had a very fractured, very poorly funded state or territory-based system around supports and services for people with disability. And if you were from Queensland, then very often disabled people actually didn't access any supports or services at all. So there's a high percentage of people using the NDIS now in Queensland who have never, ever, ever had any support or services before. So clearly what this tells us is that there's a need. We need consistency of support and services. And we want choice and control over what supports we need, who delivers them, how and when they are delivered. Okay, so we want a big say in what's happening in our daily lives. So the NDIS is a personal budget program. So previously, any supports and services that were accessed under a state or territory system came from a pot of block money, and you might get something eventually. By creating a personal budget program, people were able to individualise their packages of supports and services. So this particular concept came into being on the 1st of July 2013, and now, as of February 2022, it has been fully rolled out across Australia. Okay. Any questions on this, or do you want to hold them to the end? You let me know. No? We can take them at the end. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, just do briefly how to access the NDIS. So to access the NDIS, you first must meet an access criteria. Okay, that criteria is around disability, and it has to be lifelong and permanent, technically. Now, that gets a bit tricky when people start talking about psychosocial disability, but we can talk about that at the end. So if you meet the criteria, then you will need to fill out a form. It's on the website, and you need to provide evidence of your impairments and why you need NDIS supports. So just like anything else that you ask for, you have to give evidence and you have to say why. Okay, then your request will be assessed by the NDIA. And if you're successful in the access request, you'll then be directed to a planner who will help you create a plan that then has to go on to be approved. Okay, so it's the beginning of a process. All right, any questions around that? So this is a very condensed version, I assure you. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So since 2013, the NDIS has changed. And if there are any advocates here in the room, I'm sure you will know it has changed quite dramatically. So let's talk about what we're dealing with now, as opposed to what the scheme was supposed to be like. Let's talk about it now. The NDIS is quite rigid. And I mentioned before that in order to access it, you have to fit a certain criteria. That criteria is medical model, and it is really very diagnosis-based as opposed to functional. So a person with severe functional impairment who doesn't have the specific list of disabilities might actually struggle to get support. And we're seeing that happen because they've got this rigid list that they don't like to vary, okay? The other thing that we're discovering is that plans are not always adequate to support the needs. And you may have heard of in the news recently that a lot of people are finding their plans are being cut, which means that they're going to miss out on supports and services. So that's withdrawing supports withdrawing payment for supports, or, and this happens too, they weren't enough to begin with. So the NDIS planner has said, well, actually, this is fine, this is all you need, but actually the person with disability says, no, this isn't going to cover me for even 6 months. Okay, so there's a problem there. So appeals regarding both access and funding of supports often go unanswered for very, very long periods of time. And I'm going to explain how you can do an appeal. But there are backlogs and there are issues with internal processes within the NDIS. And many times appeals go to the AAT. So that's the federal tribunal, and it is a formal process and it's like a court. The AAT is also the place where people with immigration questions go for resolution. It's supposed to be an independent space. But, you know, the AAT can hand down a finding, but the NDIA doesn't necessarily have to follow it. That's one of the tricky things. So it is a bit tricky. We go on to the next slide. Okay, so how to get a review. Now, a review is actually a legal term. And there's a range of reviews within the NDIS. You can ask for a review about not getting access. You can ask for a review of your plan. And then you can ask for a review of a review, which means you're not happy with a result of a review. I know it's confusing, but it is a legal term. So, yeah. The review of a reviewable decision is actually listed in the NDIA legislation. So, yeah. But to break it down and to make it a bit easier, so if you are unhappy with the NDIA decision, a review can be requested within 3 months of receiving the decision. So that's 3 months from within receiving the letter, but the date on the letter specifically. Okay. They have timelines and they have time limitations. So lodge a request for a review in writing or over the phone is how you can do it. And then you ask for, I request a review of the statement of participant supports. So that's if you already have a plan, because the statement in the plan does not provide the reasonable and necessary supports. So remember, I mentioned earlier, oftentimes people are getting plans and not everything they need is in that plan. And there is a criteria. And the criteria is, are these requests reasonable and necessary? Again, this is legal stuff. Okay. Do you want to go to the next slide? How to get an appeal. So if the NDIA does not review the plan, then a person can go to external review. So if you're not happy with what has happened internally, you can go externally. And I had mentioned previously, you can go to the AAT, and that's the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. And it is a formal process. It's a separate federal entity, and it's not at all connected to the NDIA. However, people can be appointed to the AAT, and they are very often political appointments. So that's how the government can get their sway in this space. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not only, the AAT addresses not only NDIS matters, they address immigration matters, they address workplace matters. It's quite a range. Anything that falls under federal law can be reviewed at the AAT. So, and an external review or appeal, it's the last case scenario. It really is. You have to go through all those internal processes first, or rather you can choose to go through the full internal process first, or you can go straight to AAT, or internal process, then AAT. In order to have an AAT hearing, you have to lodge a application within 28 days. So if you've been refused access, if your review internal review has been denied, or you're not happy with what's been done in the internal review, you have 28 days to lodge an application to AAT. And that's just lodge the application. Okay, so there's no application fee. The AAT is technically a fee-free space, but you may need a lawyer. You can have an advocate with you, but an advocate is not a lawyer, and an advocate cannot speak. They can advise you. They may have evidence that they might be able to advise the tribunal, but they cannot actually make an argument for you in that space. So there is some provision across each state and territory legal aid commission, and there are dedicated appeals lawyers who work with that. And there's funding through DSS to help with those legal costs. I don't know whether you've heard also in the news recently that in the last 6 months, there has been a 400% increase in applications to the AAT around NDIS reviews and appeals. So what we're seeing is people's plans are not adequate, and people are taking them to the formal independent tribunal to have that addressed. Okay, we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, the AAT process. Now, I did say it was a formal process, that there is, you know, a person like a judge. He's a commissioner or she's a commissioner, and there is a whole gamut of other people. The first step is a case conference. So whilst it's an adversarial space, the process as it is not necessarily adversarial. Okay, so there's a case conference, and that's to see if the applicant and the NDIA can come to an agreement. If this doesn't happen, or rather, if an agreement does happen, then a new plan can be issued, right? Because they've had mediation and move on. If that doesn't happen, then conciliation is offered. And that's a further informal meeting with a registrar to moderate, where terms may be reached. Okay, and if this does not happen, then the hearing occurs. So this is when you go into the formal space and it looks like a courtroom. So a hearing, and this is conducted by the AAT. Both parties must be present, and they must present their submissions or their arguments before the hearing. Failure to attend a hearing may result in the case being dismissed. Now, that might sound really rigid, but you can attend via phone or video link. And that happened pre-COVID, because of course people live in places outside of towns and cities and regional areas. So there's always been an option to phone in. In the hearing, both parties will give their evidence, and then the commissioner will weigh it up and make a decision. In the past, we have found that the commissioner has delivered an outcome in favour of the disabled person. So you might ask, why would the NDIA go to all that bother of making a full process? Well, they don't do it very rarely. What they do is they stall at each point because they want to make it as difficult as possible for people to get what they want. It's not a fair process, and it's something we at PWDA are lobbying about and putting a lot of work in to make this process fairer. What we're finding is that on the evening, literally on the evening after conciliation and before the hearing, the NDIA will concede. So they'll play a game all the way up and then concede. And that is called not being a model litigant. Again, that's legal talk. Okay, so we go on to the end. I believe it's the end slide. Okay, so that was a really condensed process of the NDIS. I've included some PWDA contact details if you need advocacy support. You can phone our intake service. There's a 1-800 number, and you can also contact us via email as well. Okay, so let's open the floor to questions now, because I have made that really quick and really condensed. Okay, so maybe first we can ask, was there anything there that you didn't understand and you'd like explained further? No?
I have a question. My name's Needy.
Yep.
I just want to know how do they classify what are reviewable decisions?
Oh, okay. Well, they're laid out in the legislation. All right. As I said, it's a legal term. So it's all to do with access or your plan.
Okay.
All right. That's the only reviewable decisions you can really make under the legislation. If you have
And if for example, I'm giving you an example here to understand a little bit further.
Yep.
If for example you had a overcharge of a price guide or something for a service that you got through the NDIS, then is that considered as to be taken to the AAT, for example?
No. If you're having issues with a service provider, whether it's around pricing or any form of service delivery, then you take it to the Quality and Safeguards Commission.
Yeah.
That's
I just wanted to clarify whether that fitted into that.
Yeah.
I was pretty sure it was, but
yeah. So yeah, no, the NDIS itself is merely a bureaucratic process to access a personal budget. If you then have problems with the service provider, then you take it to the Quality and Safeguards Commission and they address it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So anybody else have any
questions?
I've
got a quick question. So initially at the start, I think it was the second slide, it stated how you apply for NDIS and then you get allocated someone to then sort of help support you. How does the allocation happen? Do they allocate it or do you have to source your own?
No, they allocate it.
Okay. So it's just in the area people are funded to do that and they just allocate you to whoever's available?
Pretty much.
Okay. Yep.
Pretty much. There's a range of there's planners and then there are local areas coordinators and then in some case there are support coordinators. And it really depends on which area you live in. This is another problem with the NDIS. There's no consistency. So what they've done, once your approval, your access approval has happened, you might deal with the NDIS as an office or you might deal with one of their subcontractors.
Yeah.
And they've decided to use not-for-profits as subcontractors. So the Benevolent Society, Mission Australia, and people like that. And it's very confusing. I really do understand. I managed to get myself quite confused too.
Yeah.
And it depends on the area you're in.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Anything else that wasn't clear? Any terms that we can help?
I just wanted to ask, I mean, it's really interesting, all the terminology you used. I support women in a domestic violence service. And all the terminology is exactly the same as a personal issue I had with Centrelink around, I care for my elderly mother. And it's exactly, and the confusion, even functioning within a system and having given support to people for so long, it completely, the review of reviews and not explaining that that's internal. And, when I found the right button to push, which was to make a complaint, through their complaints line, suddenly everything clicked, you know, as in timely. Things were done in a timely way and it got resolved. It is set up to, you know, just stall the process. So how successful, can I ask you, are you aware of how many of the reviews or appeals are successful?
Well, as I said, with the appeals, so that's the external process that goes to AAT. Most, I would say that 95% are successful, but you have to get that far.
Yeah.
So you know, people drop off along the way, and that's deliberate. That's a deliberate tactic from the NDIA. They hire hot lawyers from private firms who use all of the nasty tactics in the book in order to stop people from getting through to the final hearing. So it is like Centrelink. In fact, at one stage, they were going to put Serco in administration with the NDIS, which is similar to what they did with Centrelink. Yeah. The language, yes, is legalese, and that's because it's legislative language. However, there are peculiarities within the NDIS legislation, some of which we are trying to have addressed now. The legislation is currently under review, and this comes around giving answers around reviews. So unlike, say, for example, with immigration law, if an outcome has been found to be against the applicant, they have to give an explanation. That actually isn't necessarily the case with the NDIS. They don't have to give you an explanation. So very often what we are finding is that people are going to AAT just to find out what the problem was, because they don't know how they failed, or they don't know why they were rejected. And that's a peculiarity within the legislation. So we've highlighted that in various Senate committees to say that this is unreasonable, and we could save a whole heap of pain and agony if you just say. But it's a peculiarity of the legislation. Yeah.
Okay, one other question I'd like to ask. I've just started supporting a young woman who, and literally yesterday, and because of her trauma history and, you know, family carers and abuse, she is very distrusting. She has an NDIS plan, and we haven't even gotten to, you know, what that looks like, but she's quite concerned or negative about accessing any of it, and we haven't even unpacked, you know, the details of why that is. But any advice on navigating? Obviously she needs someone to coordinate that plan for her, because she's breaking away from family members who she, you know, doesn't want doing that. Any advice on supporting her to find the right match for her around someone to support her with that plan?
So there's some questions that need to be asked. What sort of plan is it? How is it managed? Was it self-managed? And oftentimes that means that a family member has been doing the management. Is it plan managed? That means that the NDIA themselves are doing the management, or is it provider managed? Right, so you have to identify which one of those options it falls under, and then you go to the plan manager and ask for assistance.
Okay.
Yeah, and if in her plan there is an option for a support coordinator, I would strongly recommend that that option is taken up. And if it's not in her plan, I would strongly advocate that you get a support coordinator, because that will help smooth the path. That's one of the best things about that particular role, is that it really does help smooth the path between providers, plan managers, and the client.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's great advice.
And I would also, you know, support, if you could support your client to access disability advocacy, I think would also be really helpful, because disability advocates are very familiar with that interface between the NDIS and every other system in the brain that we face.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. You're welcome. So any more questions? Would you like any more details? Did you want to talk about those interfaces? Because they're quite interesting. I didn't cover them in the slide presentation, but we can certainly talk about them more casually if you like.
Frances, I have a couple of questions or a couple of topics that I'd like more detail on, but I'll just give people another minute to see if anyone else has a question at the moment.
Sure. Excuse me, I'm just going to drink a water.
Okay, so I had a few questions or areas that I thought it would be great to speak a bit more about. One is, what constitutes reasonable and necessary supports, and how that is understood by the NDIS or interpreted. And then the other thing is, I know that it's very disappointing to hear the NDIA doesn't have a gender equity strategy at the moment, but I was wondering whether you were aware of any kind of options to fast track or to do a change of circumstances if there's a situation where a woman with disability is leaving an abusive situation where a lot of her supports have been informal from a perpetrator, and when a woman suddenly needs more supports or different supports or needs to access the NDIS, if there is any fast tracking option or how services might deal with a situation like that.
Sure. Okay, so the first one around reasonable and necessary. Now, again, this is legalese, really. And these parameters really had to go in to the legislation because the NDIS cannot provide all things to all people, and it was never intended to. So in order to give definition around supports and services, they have to be measured against this criteria: reasonable and necessary. And it is subjective. And in a sense, it has to be, because each plan is different. In recent times, the NDIA have tried to create a robo-plan situation where plans would not have been as individual, but we pushed back against that because each plan is going to be individual to each person. Where you live, what you do, what your needs are going to be individually specific. The problem is that when you've got terms like reasonable and necessary, which are subjective, and you've got a agency like the NDIA, which is currently being run akin to a private health insurance firm. This is a directive from the CEO and the co-CEO. The problem is that individuals within the agency can decide something is not reasonable and is not necessary. So, for example, recently, as in within the last 2 weeks, we have seen a man have his guide dog unfunded, a man who has had a guide dog for 40 years because the NDIA have decided it's not reasonable and necessary. Does it make sense? No. But that's the issues that we're facing at the moment because of the way the NDIA is being managed. So yes, there are issues with the language and the legislation, but really it's more of the cultural attitudes that are in the NDIA that are causing the bulk of these problems. but there's also an agenda from government, and part of that agenda is around digitisation. And words like reasonable and necessary don't necessarily compute into an algorithm. So we've got problems there. Does that help, Freya?
Yeah, it does. Absolutely.
So yeah, we need to have that subjectivity, but it doesn't currently fit the current culture and push in the NDIA. It's probably the simplest way to describe it. To address your second question, yes, it's really concerning that there's no gender equity strategy, and there has been some recent research by public policy academics around this particular problem, because the numbers are really stark. If you've got a program whereby you only have 38% of people who are women involved in the program, there's a problem with the program. We are 50% of the total population, whichever way you look at it. So that is a problem. How can a woman leaving an abusive situation, a violent situation, get supports fast-tracked, get things changed through the NDIA? Right, this comes down to where you live. As per the previous person asking around planners and so forth, it will come down to the relationship you have with your plan coordinator, support coordinator, and local area coordinator. I cannot say that there is necessarily a firm and clear policy around supporting women coming out of domestic violence, but certainly I have anecdotal evidence of some very good responses from the NDIA supporting a woman or some women that I know who have left marriages, have left abusive situations, and they have had actually excellent outcomes because their local area coordinators just got on it straight away and made sure that things were separated, made sure that the other party didn't have any access or information around what was happening with that person. So there are good stories, you know, but it's like, to be honest, I think it's like all service provision. It really depends on the people that you get and the area that you live in. Yeah, and that's one of the problems that we have with our NDIS is that it's just not consistent. So yeah, but that's a really good question, Freya, and it's something that we've been at PWDA, we've been thinking about and putting forward for a while, is what about using parts of core funding to help a woman access accommodation if she needed emergency accommodation. It's actually a suggestion we've given. So does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think it is a really important area. Should we just throw it back out and see if there are other questions? Otherwise, we might be able to talk a bit more about access requirements.
Sure.
Well, we might let people, you know, have a bit more of a think, but in the meantime, perhaps we can talk a bit more about the access requirements for the NDIS. I know that's a question that services will raise a lot in terms of not just what access requirements there are, but the difficulty of, you know, obtaining evidence that the NDIS will accept. For example, you know, they require doctors and specialists to write reports, and doctors and specialists are not always familiar with what the NDIS, you know, criteria is or what language they need to use. So I wonder if you want to speak a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. That's an ongoing issue, the access requirements. Our advice at PWDA has always been to try and get as much evidence as possible. Very often people with multiple impairments will have files and files and files you know, on their lives, and you can put those forward as good evidence. But also sometimes the NDIA want more current information, and that's because, as I said earlier, they're looking at a diagnostic position as opposed to a functional position. So yes, that does mean going to specialists. If you do a review, a plan review, and the NDIS say, no, we want you to provide more evidence of this particular situation or this particular diagnosis, you can ask them to pay for it. It's a little loophole because they've requested it. Very often though, people end up going out of pocket paying for very expensive specialists to give advice. And as you noted, a lot of GPs actually don't know a lot about the NDIS. And what we have found at PWDA is, again, depending on where you live, GPs may or may not know about the NDIS, and a lot of GPs didn't even get any education about it. So this is particularly the case when you go out to remote and rural areas. So why is the little loophole not publicly advertised? Because you have to ask for it. So it's not in there. So there's no provision and there's no guideline. So that's why it's not publicly advertised. Yeah. But technically, because they've requested it, you can say, well, then as you have requested it, then you can pay for it. Yeah. What we also advise when people are making an access request as part of their documentation is to create a scenario of your worst day. So write down in journal form, this is what my day would look like, but it'd actually be your worst day, because you want to convince them that everything you're asking for is reasonable and necessary. Bearing in mind that you've got a person looking at your file and they've been instructed to be as ruthless as possible. So you want to create a story. And that's a little piece of advice that our advocates give to people trying to access the NDIS. You're not just a number, you're a person, and you're asking for a personalised budget to help you access the supports and services that you need and want. So make it personal. If there's a specialist, so if you are going to ask the NDIS to pay for the specialist, then they'd have to organise it, because there's no process for payments around specialist services. So that's the risk that you take. If you're going to say to the NDIA rather, will you pay for it? That means that you'd have to accept the specialist that they offer and pay for. Right? So you don't get a choice. Is that clear? Yeah. So otherwise, you know, you'd go to your specialist or a specialist that your GP refers to you, and it would be just the same process as always, which you take your Medicare card, and depending on your status with healthcare concessions and so forth, you'd have to pay a gap or perhaps not. Yeah. There's a very clear distinction between NDIA and Medicare. And the NDIA will not engage medical specialists or so forth for you at your request. But if they've requested information, they can pay for it. Does that make sense? So you can't use them, but they can use themselves, for want of a better way to explain it. And they do have specialists that they use only for assessment purposes. They don't use them for therapeutic purposes. It's just assessment only. Okay. And someone's raised their hand.
Yeah, hi, Francis. That means in all practical sense, the NDIA is trying to behave like a private insurance company.
That's correct, yes.
Because that's what happens with private insurance companies. They pay the bill, but they send you to the specialist that will give a favourable outcome to the NDIA.
Correct.
Or to the insurance company, which may not coincide with the individual assessment favourability.
Correct. Correct. And that comes back to the culture within the organisation that has happened in the last, say, 4 years, where we have a CEO who's come from the private sector and a co-CEO who's come from a private consulting company. And they were given by the Prime Minister the directive to operate the NDIS as an insurance company, as in private insurance. That was their directive. They're doing what they're told. But it is not in the spirit of the legislation, and it's certainly not part of implementing the CRPD, which is what the NDIS was part of our commitment. So we got a problem, and it's a moral problem. It's tricky, isn't it?
Very, very
tricky. We do have specialist advocates who work only on NDIS appeals. It is that tricky that they don't do anything else. And then I would say, I don't know what you think, Freya, but apart from violence and maybe housing, the NDIS is probably equal in the number of advocacy cases that we manage.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's very true. It's a huge issue. And, you know, I think privilege comes into it a lot as well, because I think if you're educated or you're able to self-advocate and you have personal resources, you're much more likely to get a good outcome in the NDIS than for people with more complexity in their lives. And more complex barriers. So yeah, I think there's a lot of advocacy work that still needs to be done around the NDIS.
Absolutely. And various academics and state-based productivity commissions have identified that those people who have support through an advocate do have better outcomes with the NDIS. Because you do need that support to navigate the complexity of the system.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm mindful of the time, so I think we may need to wrap up there. And I'd just like to thank you so much, Frances. It was very concise and digestible, and you managed to cover so much in a short amount of time. So yeah, very grateful for your time today. I suppose, you know, there's some things that are really complex that we haven't been able to go into. And I would certainly suggest that it's always useful to have disability advocacy for if you're working with clients facing any of these issues, or if you're a person with disability dealing with the NDIS and having issues with that. Because yes, it is so complex. And so yeah, please, People with Disability Australia, we provide individual advocacy in New South Wales and Queensland. And yeah, if you do, also if you need advice, or if you have questions, but you're not necessarily referring a client, you can always contact us for advice and information. So that's also something to consider. And I think certainly, as Frances mentioned, the NDIS is one of the biggest issues that we deal with in advocacy, but also if somebody is experiencing abuse and needs support around that situation, and also has an issue with obtaining services or accessing the NDIS and getting appropriate supports through the NDIS, that would be a situation that we would consider to be very serious. So please get in touch with us if you need support, either for yourself or for a person you're working with. And I'd just like to say thank you all so much for being here today. And this webinar will be up on the Building Access webpage within the next few weeks. So thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Frances.
You're welcome.